Welcome, Leslie, to the Weaving Magick podcast. We're so excited to have you, and we always love to ask all of our guests this beautiful question to get started. How do you weave magic into your daily life?
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. So, I weave magic into my daily life, I think, mostly by finding the magic in the mundane. When I first started my spiritual practice, I had this like super elaborate morning ritual. It would be like wake up, make a cup of coffee, journal, meditate, do breath work, pull tarot, hang out with crystals, listen to a podcast and read. And this was taking like an hour and a half. And I'm blessed. I don't have any kids, so I have plenty of time to do those things in the morning. It was also in the winter, so it was like darker at that point, and I really loved being able to spend all that time. But as it progressed, as the pandemic hit us, I really found myself like letting all that fall by the wayside. And so now my morning practice is get a cup of chai. I'll sit on my back porch with my oldest dog, Gunner, because he's usually the only one who wakes up with me. He'll sit on the couch with me outside and just like listen to nature and breathe in the morning and then probably do some reading. I've found that my practices revolved around like reading and research a lot. Like I love reading about witchcraft. I love reading about different like feminine energy practices and doing my research. So that's kind of my main morning thing. Also, of course, I love doing research and learning about like menstrual cycle, womb work, like anything that feels magical to me that way. At night, though, it's probably my stronger magical practice, and that's moon gazing. I have been like a worshiper of the moon my entire spiritual practice. So I'll see the moon when I'm driving home from work and just like notice where she is and like open my chest up to her and feel it like all tingly. And then obviously I do full moon and new moon rituals. And then I like to say that anchoring is like word witchcraft.
Oh,
Like I try to put as
absolutely.
much like intention into the words that I say on air as I can. And then I just realized this morning, I'm like, well, it's kind of like glamour magic to put like TV Leslie on versus like real Leslie, like all my makeup and all like I wear hair extensions and it's just like a whole different vibe to be the TV version of myself versus like the real life me. But yeah, those are just some of the ways that I like to weave magic into my daily life.
I want to hear more about this anchor you that you put together.
Think of like Glinda the Good Witch.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Or like, yeah, I don't know what I would call her. She's like sassy, right? So she's like the boss bitch energy, that version of me for sure. And it's interesting because at one point in my career, I was even wearing wigs on air. So I felt like even more not myself. But yeah, when people see me at the grocery store or like wherever, I'm never wearing makeup. My hair up's up in a bun. And they're like, wait, aren't you the TV lady? And I'm like, yeah, that's like TV Leslie. This is real life Leslie. Um, yeah, it's just kind of, if you think about it, almost like an armoring up. So you
Mm.
be like ready to present that part of yourself. I haven't in recent years been able to feel more myself in that person, but in the beginning of my career I really felt like I was like playing this role, like I play a TV anchor on TV.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So now it's just kind of a little more myself, but then again, as I progress into this other side of me, this other work, there does seem to be this big division between those two people, these two aspects of myself, like the one who's the front facing public figure and then the other one who's like into all of this other shit.
hmm hmm Do you tend to, this is a little random, do you tend to have any crystals on you or anything while anchoring? Or
Hell yeah.
what's your favorite that you put in the pocket or in the cleavage, you
So
know?
in the well, I'll have one in my yoni sometimes. Like I usually go to
Nice.
egg.
Okay.
Clear quartz is always like a favorite of mine. But then at my desk at work, like I like to say, like my coworkers know probably more about my spiritual practice than anyone because I've got like tons of crystals, and I'll like be like, guess what I read today? But I have what do I have at work? I have lapis lazuli, which
Ooh.
is good for communication and throat chakra. I have fluorite. I have smoky quartz, obsidian, obviously, and probably a little tourmaline, like very much like protection,
Yeah.
energy cleansing, things like that. I used
Communication. I
to
love the
wear,
lapis lazuli. That's perfect.
yeah, I used to wear like a necklace. And my necklace was usually like amethyst, but I don't know where it went. I was looking for it recently and I can't find it. So, yeah, between having them either in my bra or my body, physically in my body, yeah, there's usually a crystal on or about my person.
I've heard one time that whenever a crystal breaks or whenever it like disappears, it means it has given enough of its time to you or something, like it moves on.
Okay. Maybe that's where that amethyst is.
It'll come back if it needs you, or vice
Yeah,
versa.
absolutely.
So how would you say you're able to balance this quote unquote 9 to 5 that is not really a 9 to 5, since you're like
Mhm.
you have different schedules with that, and being able to do your podcast while also being your kind of witchy self?
It's definitely been the year of me living like radically authentic online. Like 2021, I guess I made this decision early on after I read Sahara Rose's book, Discover Your Dharma. I was like, I need to figure out how to continue to give more of myself. And so the little mundane, magical things I do help me keep my vibes high. But then it's almost like this other side of myself, the podcast and the menstrual cycle coaching and all that research helps me have enough fire to do the anchoring, because let's be honest, the pandemic has been fucking rough. And as it progresses, like in the beginning of March 2020, it was so weird. Like we had no idea what was going on. And in the news business, we were trying to figure out like 17 different things, who to listen to. And obviously like the government didn't really know what they were talking about. And we still had to just like put news on the air. And that was also when like everything got shut down. Like it's hard to remember back that far, but everything was getting shut down in March 2020. And I remember going into this meeting and they were basically shutting our newsroom down, except for me. I had to be there. My boss had to be there, and one producer.
Wow.
So that was so rough. Like I've only cried at work like a couple times. We went and tried to do like an hour of news at 10 o'clock, which is half an hour more than what we usually do. And we did that for like 4 days. And I remember my boss being like, well, we're not going to do that anymore. And I was just crying. I was like, thank God. Cause it was just so much more, that just that little bit of time was so much more energy for me.
Yeah.
And so the pandemic, the vibes of the pandemic as a news anchor was like, we were so up then, like it was breaking news, like we were like hitting the ground running. And as we've progressed, what are we like 18 to 20 months into this shit now? Like it is so draining to have to continually do the same story over and over and over again. Like it's really draining me. So I like that I have the podcast to like keep that up. But I feel like, the podcast also has kind of led me in this other direction and allowed me to do more of what I love as part of my job. So I love the interviewing part of my job, getting to do stories that really light me up. And that's exactly why I put the podcast together, because I got to interview all these amazing people in 2020 because everything was shut down and my boss let me start doing Zooms. So I was doing Zooms with people like all over the whole world for this work.
Wow.
In Central Texas. And so I'm like, I need to talk to these people long form and uncensored. So that's really what the podcast was all about. And I think, also leaning into the menstrual cycle, like learning about that in 2020, learning about the natural ebbs and flows of my energy really helps me do the work, both as an anchor and in the podcast. And it feels like in those moments that I dive into my menstrual cycle and I plan out my work either at the news station or at the podcast, that's when I have like the most energy. Like I'll work with, my follicular cycle or ovulatory cycle and really like get everything done. And then in the luteal phase, I'll do all of my like bookkeeping and my editing. And it really just feels like those two aspects of myself have been able to kind of really work in tandem to help me keep my energy high and to be able to focus and like balance all of that. I'll also say though that I notice myself feeling a lot more magical, a lot more magnetic, a lot more high vibe when I'm sober. And so I started a sober curious journey in April of 2020, just because I was so, panicky by all the shit that was going on. And I was sober for a couple of months. And then I started drinking again consciously, like noticing why am I drinking? And if it was ever like I have an emotion or a fear or a feeling that I'm trying to like mask by this alcohol, then I would not drink. Like I would notice those things and be like, okay, what's going on? The only exception was last December, right before I took like a long time off drinking, I went back home to visit my family and they're very triggering and I was drunk like every single day. So I'm like, okay, but I find that when I choose not to drink, I have more time to do my magical practices. Like I'm not hungover in the morning. And then I have a whole lot more energy for all of this other stuff. So I'm currently in a space where I'm not drinking right now as I finish up my cycle coaching and like embark on this next phase of my life. Um, so yeah, I would say those are kind of the things that help me keep up that magical energy.
Mm-hmm. You
Go
say that
ahead.
you're gonna continue to step away from drinking for a while longer, or do you think you'll try to do it consciously again?
I'll probably do it consciously. I'm such a wino. Like I am obsessed. That's the only thing I drink now really is wine. And I've found excellent alternatives for white wine,
Mm-hmm.
but I have never found an alternative for red. So it's going to be fall and winter. It'll be tough not to drink red wine. Like the second it feels like fall, I'm like, oh my gosh, I just want a great big glass of red wine. But I also notice I have a lot of anxiety and one drink, I'll be up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking about some shit that I've concocted in my head that is a worry that like probably will never happen. Like the reason that I really stopped drinking most recently is I really started having like fears over like what I'm going to do next in my life. And I would wake up in the middle of the night afraid of that, freaked out, worried. I'm like, I wonder if I stop drinking, if I'll stop second guessing myself in the middle of the night. And because it's not intuition that I'm hearing, it
Yeah.
is full on fear. Like it's in a different spot in the body. Like the podcast has let me talk to these amazing healers and coaches. And I have learned so much by being able to get like an hour basically free with them every time I talk to them. And so I've really been able to understand, even talking with you about like where intuition lies in the body. And I kept feeling like, oh, all of these little like things that would get into my brain and I would feel in my chest
Mm-hmm.
were trying to tell me something that I should like change my life around. And no, like that's absolutely not where my intuition is. That's where your anxiety and your fear is. It's
Yeah.
not like you need to, don't guide your life by those feelings. Like if you feel it in like your pussy, that's like where it is in my belief, right? Like in my gut and like in my yoni, that's like where it's at.
Yeah.
I agree with that completely. Have you ever thought about maybe integrating the red wine into your ritual?
I had a girl that I met at this, it was called the Intro to Esoeroticism. It was a dance class at this super witchy dance studio in Austin, Texas called Minx and Muse. And she was really into that. She was like, she would have these like rituals around like conscious drinking. And at that time, it was still too triggering for me to even like think about that. But yeah, I also kind of am very into like ancestral work right now, like just getting into it. And then obviously like alcohol is a thing that people often offer to their ancestors. Now, my ancestral tree is a little bit varied because I was adopted. So I'm like not super sure who everybody is. But yeah, I'd like to look into that. And I think I get to a point when I am sober curious is what I like to call it. Like when I'm in my sober part of the sober curious, that alcohol can be in the house and I don't like feel like I need to drink it. So maybe, yeah, I could do it with rituals or consume more like consciously.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's some medicine there that,
Mm.
just because any substance, because the same thing with plant medicine too, you can use it in a way to cover up things that you're feeling, but it also can be used in a way to unlock things.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I'm exploring myself. That's why I'm
Oh,
picking your brain
nice.
about it.
Mm. And I was thinking about how spirits, alcohol, if you look at like the spirits version of it and just thinking of, I've never heard of it being like, as you said, Alyssa, intentional use as like medicine versus a lot of it being used to numb. But I do like that of, using it almost like if you were to do mushrooms or marijuana or that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and doing so consciously kind of learning about your body and about what it is triggering kind of thing?
I think it was Carl Jung who originally was talking about the whole idea that like spirits, if you're addicted to spirits, it can mean that you like are longing for spirituality.
Mhm.
Somebody was talking about that. I read it in a book or heard it on a podcast recently, and I think it might have been Young, but it sounds like some teachings that he would have.
Okay.
But like that to me, when I heard that, I'm like, oh my God, you're totally right. Like when I was in my late 20s after I went through my divorce, I was drunk like all the time. And it was because I had this innate longing for something more and for something bigger than myself. And so that's also kind of interesting as to why I think I've been very successful with being sober curious over the last 2 years, even in the midst of like the most traumatic and like stressful time in this planet's most recent history,
Mhm.
is because I had a spiritual practice that I could fall back on. And it's like when I consume more alcohol, the spiritual practice falls by the wayside. When I don't, the spiritual practice grows. So it definitely has some type of like, I think, more esoteric connection.
Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of why I'm like, when I feel like I haven't been doing my spiritual stuff for a while, I'm like, ugh, how much wine have you been drinking, girl? And then it's like, oh, aha, that's an easy explanation right there.
Mhm.
I love that awareness. I heard you talk about your womb work a little bit. You know, I love womb work. So, talk to
Hmm.
us about your journey with your menstrual cycle and that relationship.
Okay, so I was gonna start by telling you guys my menarche story, my like first period story, because I feel like if you understand this, then you understand kind of where I'm at when it comes to my period.
Mm.
So my mom had a radical hysterectomy before I was born. I'm adopted, and so is my sister. And so she never was like bleeding actively, like in our house. Like we never saw it, we never were around it. And my first period started the summer between fifth and sixth grade. I think I was 11, and it was the night before I went to sleepaway camp. And my mom like didn't have anything in the house. Like she didn't have any pads or tampons. I think she had like a panty liner. So I noticed it early in the day on the Saturday, but it was brown. And I'm like, did I poop myself? Like, what is this? Like, like when you very first start, even now, it's oftentimes not like blood red at the very beginning.
Mhm.
I had no idea what was going on. I didn't tell my mom for like hours and hours. And when I finally did, I was like so nervous and like I just felt scared to tell her. And we weren't like a naked family. Like we weren't a family that like saw each other in that type of undress. Like we weren't um a very like close, like intimate family like that, like some people are. And I didn't have that relationship with my mom at all. So I finally tell her, she gives me this panty liner. The next day we went to the store. I think it was like just after church. And so she's like, if you're going to go swimming at sleepaway camp, like you need to wear a tampon. I'm like, oh, okay. 11. Haven't had my period for 24 hours, right? And so she's like, okay, but I have to show you how to do it. I'm like, okay. So I like couldn't get it in. She had to put it in for me. Traumatizing. Like I said, like that's not traumatizing to the body because it's a tampon and you're
Mhm.
a baby basically, and your mom is doing it for you. So we drive to camp. It's like a couple hours later. And before she leaves, she's like, I had to make sure you can get this out. Cause she also talked to me like about toxic shock syndrome, which is a terrifying situation. So of course, I'm a parent and I'm a paranoid child. Like I have been like a worried, anxious child like my entire life. So I cannot get it out. And she's like, okay. So she pulls it out for me. Right. And it's like not full, so painful. Needless to say, I did not use a tampon for years after this like initial traumatizing situation. Used pads the rest of like, I think it was like a couple days that I had my period. Maybe it like lasted through like Wednesday or Thursday. I think I got to swim like a couple times. But towards the middle of the week, I thought I was going to run out. And so I was so freaked out. I was worried. I was like, I don't know what to do. And I'm someone who doesn't like to express everything like as it comes up. I like to like bottle it up until I freak out and then like explode over some other little random thing. And so I finally am just like crying in my room. My roommate goes and gets my counselor, and this like college kid, like this poor freshman or sophomore, like comes in here and she's like, help me out. And she's like, we have everything you need. You just had to ask. And I was like, I was so embarrassed to ask. Right. And so the other thing that happened right after that is, well, let's evaluate what was happening in that first period of mine, right? Like fear, anxiety, pain, trauma, stress, not being at home, being in like a totally different scenario and just feeling like you had to hide it, right? And I think that's really the theme of most menstruators' lives, is, at least in the beginning, right? Is like having to hide this embarrassing thing. Well, the next part was I didn't have a period right afterwards, right? Like I didn't have one the next month or the next month or the next month. And so because of the fact that I was raised in this like super Christian household, I had a little bit of knowledge about like what was going on with my body, but nobody told me really that like it's not going to be every month. And so I thought I was pregnant. Okay. Straight up thought I was pregnant. And I'm like, oh my God, how on earth could I have been pregnant? And I think back and I'm like, oh my God, you know what? I went on a beach trip with my family. I probably used my dad's towel and now I'm probably pregnant. Okay. And that was like, I really thought that, really freaking thought that. Finally, and I was like, I can't tell my mom, right?
Yeah.
Like, how fucked up is this? So you can laugh about it now, but like as an 11-year-old kid living in a situation, terrifying. I was so fucking terrified. And I just had this huge fear over my body throughout my entire teen years, right? Because even when I did finally become like more sexually active, like let's don't get it twisted. I thought I was going to be a virgin until I was married. Didn't happen. But I had a boyfriend in high school and we would do like everything but like I had these rules where like if he was naked, I couldn't be naked because that might make me get pregnant. And if I like got his semen on my hand, I would scald my hands under burning hot water and like wash them with soap and then like refuse to wipe for like the rest of the day because somehow that was going to like magically make me become pregnant. And so that fear is what like led me to get on the pill to shut up my menstrual cycle because I was terrified all the time that I could just fall pregnant. And so I went on the pill in freshman year of college and then continued on the pill until, or some form of hormonal birth control until I was 34, until 2020. And it was just my study of like the spirituality and of the divine feminine that kind of started letting this little like seed grow in my brain that like I want to experience what life is like not on the pill. And I'm child free by choice. Like I never want to have children. And so my fiance at the time, now husband, he was the same way. So he decided to get a vasectomy in February 2020. And then in May, I went off of the pill. And I had done all this research beforehand because I was like, there's no way this is not going to be something weird happen. Because you've been on these hormonal synthetic birth control pills and these different kind of hormones for so many years. It could be wild coming off of it. So I had done all this research. I get off the pill in May and then I don't have a period for like maybe a month and a half. It's super brown and super light. And then another month and a half, I have another little period. And then my symptoms start popping up. And I guess I should say right after going off the pill, my main symptom was mood swings. Like I would be happy one minute and I want to kill everybody the next minute. Libido was completely non-existent. And if you look into what birth control pills do to your libido, it's scary as shit because it very well like may have damaged that hormone like irreversibly. So the other big symptoms that started popping up in September were cystic acne, painful, deep cystic acne on my chin and mouth. And I had flawless skin for years. And so that was freaking traumatizing as shit because I'm a news anchor too. So I'm like, oh my God, that literally is my moneymaker. So my hair started falling out. My cycle was still pretty irregular. And so I went and got some tests done, found out that I had PCOS, and it was those things like the research into the PCOS that kind of led me into being very obsessed with my menstrual cycle, trying to cycle sync and just like trying to get my period to be this like red, beautiful, like 3 to 4 day bleed is really what like led me into trying to do this menstrual cycle work. But then, like I mentioned, when I read Sahara's book earlier this year and started looking into what is my dharma is a teacher. And I knew that. And I knew I was already doing that as a journalist. But I thought I could do more. So that's where the podcast came from. And then I had a younger coworker who I was giving advice to or something. And she's like, you know what, you should be a life coach. Like, seriously, like you have great advice. And so I very briefly considered doing Sahara's Dharma Institute, like life purpose coaching or whatever she has going on. I even gave all my money to that. And thankfully they had like a 2-week grace period where you could get your money back, because not 2 days after I said yes, the menstrual cycle course opened. And I'm like, oh, holy shit, yes. And it was with a teacher I had followed since like early 2020. And so that's kind of what got me into it. It's just the connection that I had with my own body after going off the pill was so much stronger than before. And also, I don't want any little girls to be as terrified of their bodies as I was. Like, you shouldn't think that you used a towel,
Yeah.
maybe, and you maybe are pregnant. Like, that's like so disempowering. And so I just want to help young menstruators feel empowered by their bodies and not scared and ashamed like I did. Like, I think we should be proclaiming very loudly, that, oh, we're bleeding and this is amazing. And hopefully one day we get there. But if I can just help those young menstruators feel proud of themselves and excited versus feeling like they can't talk to people about what's going on, and in turn then being terrified, like, then I think that's like my mission done, right? Like, mission complete. That's really where my menstrual cycle journey has really been. A long way to say, like, I don't want somebody to have the same lived experience as I did.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's really important for young menstruators to know that there's more than just pads and tampons that you get at Walmart that are so much better for your body. Oh my goodness.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Like, if I had period panties as a kid,
oh
God. And I just went and saw my nieces, that one is about to be 10 and the other is 12. And I'm like, you know what? We don't have, I didn't talk to them about this. Like, I don't really have that conversation with them. But I'm like, I'm just going to start giving them all like gift cards to period panties for birthdays and Christmas, because seriously, and they've got bathing suits now. Like, they've got period bathing suits. I'm like, damn, I could have been
didn't
swimming
even know
that
was
whole
a thing.
time. Yeah, they've got them. They're like, I guess just really thick. I haven't tried one. My coworker's daughter, I think, has them. But yeah, God, that would have been life-changing.
That's what I used period underwear for after Aurelius was born. I used that instead of the massive like
diapers.
Yeah, and like the weird. Yeah, it was amazing because they were also tight on me, so I didn't feel like I needed that tightness around my stomach, my abdomen after giving birth, because it just felt so. It feels so flabby, and like having that tight actually holds you in and feels nice. But I was gonna say that in my high school experience, I also chose to not have sex until college, actually, but did everything but, and I actually believed that by swallowing semen you could get pregnant.
Oh, okay.
Like, and, I mean,
yeah,
like that versus like a towel. Okay, like you can see that more. But I mean, like, to me, it was going right through me, and I was, I had to convince myself of that. So there's a lot of fear that is just not talked about, because all you hear is like, well, don't have sex.
Yeah.
Just
absolutely
abstinence. And you're like, well, no. Like, cool if you want that, but that's not the end all cause. Like, there's more to it. And I think when you said, your husband got a vasectomy, it just makes me go back to how women, we have that option, but you get hell for it. Like, a lot of women don't just get the chance to say, I don't want kids. I'm going to get a hysterectomy, which obviously it's harder for women than vasectomy tenfold. But it's like, well, you may want kids later.
I know.
Let's go ask your dad, your spouse, whatever,
And sometimes they'll still refuse.
Yes, absolutely. I had a friend who had horrible endometriosis for years, like her entire 20s. And she finally was allowed to get a hysterectomy when she was like 31 or 32. Yeah. And I think that part of the reason that we're seeing a lot of people, have issues like endometriosis, like I believe, obviously some people are just destined to have that because it's genetic, I believe, in some ways as well. But like, I think the inability to talk about these things, and like, if you think about it energetically, like us holding on to that shame, us holding on to that guilt, us holding on to, this secret of our period, can that live into our bodies? Can that create trauma? Can that create pain in the form of endometriosis? And I think also it's interesting, right? Like, us thinking we could get pregnant by these like weird things any moment of the day. Is that also contributing to women who are also in their 20s and 30s now having so many problems with fertility because they never understood their bodies in the first place? And you get off the pill or you get off of whatever birth control you've been using and you're like, okay, great, I'm going to fall pregnant next week.
Yeah.
And it's just not like that for so many people. And it's like, it's just so clearly to me like a way that this society has tried to keep women down when it comes to their bodies. Like if we were teaching women all of these empowering things, we probably wouldn't have half the problems that we have. I wholeheartedly believe that we'd have less of an issue with unplanned teen pregnancy if they fully understood their fucking bodies.
Oh yeah.
But we don't want to teach them that because if they're empowered enough to know their bodies, then they're not going to stand for all the bullshit that you're freaking putting on them.
I mean, and they even do it through shame of like, here, let's go give you, at least at my school, here's a fake baby that cries and
Oh my gosh.
baby. And it's like, you can see what this is like and how horrible and traumatic this is, which, I mean, yes, it's tiring, but like, let's actually learn more about that.
I feel like that also leads into shame with pregnancy. When I got pregnant with my first child, I had been trying for years and it was an exciting thing, but I was afraid to share it because it felt like this shameful thing. Like, oh, she's pregnant. What?
I mean, we had just graduated. I had just graduated from college and had a job, wasn't married. So, there's that. But I still had shame because I was like, oh, I'm so young. And I was, but not like if you look at like, high school in a sense. And so I was shame. Yeah, I felt shameful around that as well. And, in Ayurveda, disease is what leads to trauma and to, sorry, let me say that emotions are what lead to disease in the body in Ayurveda. And they say that you can begin to notice before you get sick, someone who's really practiced with their body and with like being mindful about it and that kind of stuff, 2 weeks before you actually start to get sick. You can see how it progresses because all of it, the mind body connection in Ayurveda is so in tune that nothing is separate from it, that whatever that, trauma you're experiencing, the emotions you're feeling, they go back to, okay, well, there's a pitta imbalance, there's this imbalance, and that kind of stuff. And it helps you narrow in that if you can help with the emotions early on, the disease is less likely to form because it's more of a preventative. So it definitely is that those emotions, that shame, that trauma go into forming that disease lifelong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I believe even if it is something genetic, that we can still navigate healing those emotions that we're storing to help us navigate that disease and mitigate the symptoms such as PCOS or endometriosis that we were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the research that I was doing early on, specifically around hysterectomies, it's like the most common surgery for women. And they're doing tons of them. And I'm like, is that because our medicine in this like Western society is very much like a pill for an ill versus let's heal the core issues? Same with me in PCOS. When I first was diagnosed with PCOS, you know what the first thing they told me? You could go back on the pill.
Yeah.
Like, are you kidding me? That's how we got here. Like, that's absolutely not what's happening. And I'm like, I'm good. Like, thanks, but no thanks. I've only ever used the pill to prevent pregnancy. And now I can't get pregnant because of this vasectomy my husband had. Like, I'll figure it out. And I'm glad that I did that. Although there were times when my acne was really bad and my hair was falling out and I was like, oh my God, am I just going to fucking go backwards? So I'm glad that I didn't, because now my PCOS symptoms are gone. Like I believe what I had was termed post-pill PCOS, which is very common when you come off of hormonal birth control after 16 plus years. And it can take a long time to get that period back. I finally started having like blood red periods 6 months after I came off the pill, 6 to 7 months, which I think is early compared to some people. But yeah, it's just like this whole society where we're like, let's just fix you real quick, boom, 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 without the whole like deeper understanding of what really is going on in your body.
Well, and I personally believe it has to do a lot with the spiritual, if you want to look at lack of spiritual if we look at like, my personal opinion of Christianity in some ways, connection and like how some of it is, this is our belief and this is what it's going to be, versus it's okay to go into your body and figure things out, and that
Oh my
not
God,
be
yeah.
your Christianity, your belief and connection with God. That's okay, but that does influence a lot. But I'm curious, I think I know the answer, but do you do blood magic with your period, and like how do you incorporate that?
Well, when I was doing my first deep dive into spirituality, I'm like, ooh, blood magic. That sounds great. Sex magic. That sounds awesome. So I don't really do, I would say, like magic with my spiritual practice. Mostly, I think because I haven't had the time, and it's something that I'm very interested in. I just have not done it. However, I do think if you have sex while you're bleeding, that's blood magic.
Yeah.
It's also sex magic. And my God, if you manifest when you orgasm, that's like the deepest combination of all the things. And that's truly like, you don't really even have to put that much thought into it. You don't have to go into it with like casting a circle and all the candles and you've got like crazy silky sheets. You don't have to go into it with all those things. It truly can just be like that simple. Have sex on your period.
Yeah.
And there's all these funny memes like on TikTok and Instagram about like women having sex on their periods and like the men afterwards being like, why am I in love with this woman? And we're like, blood magic. But no, I do rituals, and have talked to people on the podcast about sacred menstruation, which I find just like so interesting, like bleeding straight onto the earth. So I give my period blood to my plants. I haven't gotten it down. I had just heard Mia Magic talking about this. I haven't gotten it down so much so that like she says she can like feel her blood dropping. She'll go outside and just like pull up her dress and like bleed straight onto the earth. Like I haven't gotten to that. Plus I'm also at like a job a lot of the time. So that might be like a little weird. Like we do have like a weird little garden in the back, but like I don't know how they feel if I'm just like out there squatting over it. But anyway, I'll use period panties or a menstrual cup, collect the blood, give it to my plants. The other thing I really like to do that's more like the woo woo, like I have some other rituals that are anyone can do. My other like more woo woo one is putting it on my face, like creating a menstrual blood skincare mask. And sometimes I'll just like anoint my forehead with it. I did that one time. I didn't tell my husband, and I just like was reading a book in bed, and he walks and he's like, what in the fuck is on your face? And I'm like, it's blood. He was very like, oh my God. But no, I just saw this really cool recipe where it's like a mix of honey and moon blood and like maybe a little water to give it a little bit more like like easily spreadable consistency. But it makes my face glow afterwards because it's all stem cells, right? Like people pay good money for that. And I love doing that. I also love to take baths. Yeah, give it to the plants, give it to the earth. And like, even when I'm not bleeding, just like to connect with my womb, like belly breathing with your hands in like the yoni mudra, which is like your forefingers and your thumbs like touching, and it's like making like a, like a, looks like a womb, right? Like an upside down kind of triangle over your like yoni space, just to breathe into that. And baths. I'm obsessed with baths. So I feel like that's a way that you can connect with your womb, even if you're bleeding, just to bathe.
How would your husband like felt about your journey?
You read my mind. I was going to ask.
So you want to know about my spiritual like witchcraft practice journey or like the period journey, or both?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the period stuff, he's like so now well versed in. He's like, what phase are we in? What food are we eating this week? And I have this really cool diagram that I made him that's like the 4 phases, and I'll like put a little magnet like, this week we're in follicular phase, which we're in follicular phase, and like this is what I need from you, and this is what kind of sex I might want, and these are my feelings. And so I'll like, like whatever emotion it is. And what's interesting though is in the very beginning when I started writing that, I didn't feel comfortable enough to be like, I don't want sex, like I still felt like this responsibility in some way to like allow that to be on the table, even though I knew at times like my yoni was like, no, because I really had to do a lot of yoni work in the beginning to start connecting with that part of me. Like, we don't really even look at our pussies.
No.
Unless because it's obviously like kind of hidden. You got to get like a mirror down there, and especially growing up like I did, like, no, it was like weird to look at it. Like, so being able to like honor it for what it is, like this beautiful vessel and portal to create life. And as someone who isn't having children, I've had to, it's been tough for me to figure out how to get out of like the maiden archetype, right? Like to move into mother archetype. As a 35-year-old woman, I will look at women who are younger than me, who are mothers, and I'm like, I feel this huge disconnect. Like, I'm like, I feel like I'm a maiden and I quote unquote shouldn't be. Like, I need to move on to this next step of my life. And so doing this like yoni work, I have slowly been able to start realizing you can use that to birth things that aren't human life,
Yeah.
to birth projects, to birth this next like chapter in your life. So he has really been into some of that, like the crystals. Like I replaced all my sex toys with like crystal sex toys. Yoni eggs. He's into that stuff. He'll like even use them with me. And it's almost like he's more interested in using those than the silicone dildos, because it's like, I don't know what it is about like, the men in our lives. Like if you've got like a dildo that maybe is like looks different than their own penis, like they feel some type of way. So he's much more into, and I think accepting of using those types of sex toys with me. And then he loves the chart. But now I have finally been able to be like, I don't want any sex at all. Don't fucking look at me. Leave the house. Like that's usually like the day before my bleed, right? Like I'm going to kill you if you look at me. But as far as claiming the word witch, that has been a more, I don't know if I would say slow acceptance, because let's be honest, like I do what I want and he's cool with it. Like that's our relationship. And for those who are in relationships where that's not how it is, like, I'm sorry. We have an interesting dynamic, the two of us. Like, so we have this new house that we built. I have my own space. I call it the womb room, and I've called it that since we moved in, and he has his own space. So he's accepting of it, but he's questioned a lot of it. And he's seen me go in and out of like being really interested in it and then not being interested in it, because that's kind of, I think, as someone who most likely has adult ADHD, that's like my MO. Like I'll get real fired up about something and then kind of like forget about it for a while and then go back into it. When he sees me ebb and flow through this more witchy spiritual practice, I think he sees that as questioning versus me just kind of having other things that light me up, right? Like I'll just kind of ebb and flow. But yeah, he's definitely more accepting and chill with the period stuff than I think he is about the witch stuff, but he's okay with it. Like he gets it. He's like, he'll call me his little witch. So it is what it is, but it's rough, right? Because of both of our families' backgrounds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit more about coming out of the broom closet just generally.
When you guys sent me this question, I was like, oh my gosh. And honestly, like when you asked me to be on this podcast, I was like feeling resistance around it, because while I have discussed in brief conversations like what my spiritual beliefs are on my own podcast, I haven't like just straight up come out and talked about it. So I'm over that. Like I've reckoned with those feelings. But this question, I was like, oh man, how am I going to answer it? So I am still very much in the broom closet with my family. However, friends, acquaintances, coworkers, strangers on the internet, I think know more about what my beliefs are than my family. And so, as I said earlier, 2021 has been like the year I want to be more radically authentic. And it started with the podcast. And it also started with me going to therapy. And I went to therapy to talk about like my anxiety, some past eating disorder stuff, and my marriage. But what she wanted to talk about and what kept coming up were my issues with my mom. And I was like, I don't feel like I have issues with my mom, because in my head, issues with moms are like fighting. And I don't have any relationship with my mom really. Like, like sometimes it's just like, she's just a non thing in my head. Apparently that's also a very common mother wound. And so as I was talking to the therapist, she's like uncovering all these beliefs I had. Like I felt unseen. I felt like my husband didn't know me. I felt like nobody knows who the fuck I really am, because I do play a part of an anchor on TV. Like that is the person people see and that's who they think they know, but I'm somebody completely different. And I'm like, no one knows me. And so we uncovered the fact that like, because of the way that I was raised and the personality I had as a child, it most likely came from the fact that like, I felt like I needed to be perfect. I was the oldest kid. And I kind of just parroted my family's beliefs. When I started thinking things that were different from theirs, I hid that. And so of course I felt like nobody knew because they couldn't see the real me. And so my therapist was saying, maybe you can talk to your mom about this. I'm like, oh my God. She's like, maybe you could just share your podcast with her, because if my family listened to my podcast, they would know much more about who Leslie really is. So I shared this like very palatable episode with them when I was talking about being sober curious, because that's easy for them to digest. And it kind of opened a conversation with her, but oh man, I fucked it up. I said in some kind of a text form, because we text a lot because we're very word people. Like it's easier for us to come across that way. I said, I'm questioning my Christian beliefs. What I should have said is, I questioned them. I found them to be lacking. I don't believe that anymore, because instead it opened this door for her to kind of proselytize to me in the text messages. And I guess I should say, like, straight up, my dad's a preacher. Like that. I didn't say that off the jump, but my dad's a preacher. My mom was a Bible teacher. My husband's dad was a missionary. So it's like, we got a lot of that ingrained in here. But she was like proselytizing to me in the text messages and saying things like, well, read this person because he was an atheist who set out to prove that God wasn't real. And now he's a Christian who's like a best-selling author. And she never asked me like what I really believe. Because if she'd asked me, I would have been like, I believe in God. I call her goddess because, first of all, the patriarchy. And secondly, like, who else could create an entire universe like you believe except a woman? Like, it's not a man. It sure as fuck is not a man. Like, problem number one, right? And then I'm like, all these other things like Jesus, great, cool with him, love his teaching. I think most Christians have forgot that teaching. We wouldn't be where we are with the pandemic right now if you were loving your neighbor as yourself. We wouldn't have the immigration problem if we were letting these people come in because we want to help them like Jesus would. And it's like, she never asked me. So I would love to have the conversation with them around like those deconstructed Christian beliefs specifically. But I've also kind of gotten to this point where I'm more just at ease with the whole idea that like I probably won't have this conversation with them, and I'll continue to be as much myself as I possibly can with them, but then also be okay if they like never really get it. And, Tara and I've talked because we have very similar backgrounds as well. And I don't know, something like you texted me basically, and you were like, about praying. Like my mom was always like, oh, we'll pray for you. And I pray that you're happy. And I'm like, if you would ask me, I would tell you I'm happy as shit. I'm the happiest I've ever been. And I'm like, I got so triggered by her being like, I'll pray for you. Cause it's such like a throwaway sentence, right? Like thoughts and prayers.
And
But
it also feels like they're saying, I'm going to pray for this specific outcome. I want you to be this person versus how you feel.
Pray that you find your way back to Jesus, to God. And now I'm like, okay, I just feel like, I think you said to just like think of those as blessings, think of those as like good vibes. But yeah, I didn't really have this word for what I was doing until recently when I heard it on a witch podcast and they were talking about deconstructing my Christian beliefs. And so that's kind of what I've been up to for the past like year and a half. And as far as like how witchcraft and being a witch plays into that, I think that's one of the reasons why it would be so tough for me to have this conversation with them, because they think this completely other thing about what it means to be a witch. And for me, being a witch is someone who stands in their power, who stands up for what they believe, who is wise, who tries to do good for the collective, but also takes no shit, like a fully empowered, in my lived experience, woman. And I think that's kind of where, I don't know, it's just like, we could talk all day about my problems with the Bible and stuff like that. And yeah, it's been rough, but the long story short is like, I'm still in the broom closet a little with my family, and random strangers know me more, I think, sometimes than they do.
And family, you would be considered as like mom, dad, sister, and then probably.
That's it. Well, like extended family. Okay. I think Micah's family like knows a little bit more because they're kind of around us more. And he has 3 brothers, 2 of whom are married. But like, I'll kind of just throw stuff in there. It's interesting because it's almost like as I become more like this womb goddess energy, it almost opens the door more to be like questioning these things and bringing them out. Like, why do we think that Eve was the, the one who we were blaming for all this shit? Like, and I just remember thinking, like, hearing those stories, like, oh, your period's going to be painful because of Eve, like blame Eve. Like, I don't know. There's just all this, like, all these things. And I'm like, no, 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 no.
So I know quite a few people, and I'm sure there will be some magic weavers listening that struggle with this concept of being a Christian, believing in God, and being a witch. What advice would you have to give them?
Well, I will say I do not claim the aspect of being a Christian anymore.
Right.
But I am someone who believes in God. And I would say you just have to be very, honest with yourself about the things you do believe and you don't believe. Like, I definitely know there are Christian witches out there. In the very beginning, when I was looking into witchcraft, I still would have said I'd identified as a Christian. But honestly, I don't really have a lot of advice for them, because for me, it's just something that has been such a big disconnect because of the fact that I have problems around the way that women specifically are illustrated and discussed in the Bible. However, if you can get around that, and that isn't something that does bother you, I do love the idea that, like, a lot of these world religions have a lot of, like, witchy pagan things in there. For me, that is honestly one of the reasons why it would be easy to be a Christian witch, because you already have these rituals you see, like the communion, like Holy Communion, like the taking of the body and the blood of Christ. And I'm like, if that isn't like the witchiest ritual I've ever seen in my life, holy shit. And the smoke, like in Catholic, like masses, when they're like with the smoke, like yeah. So I can see kind of where they really go really well together. For me personally, though, I'm in a part in my life, and maybe this will change, obviously, because I feel like I change all the time, where I'm just very pissed off about, like, how I was raised and the thoughts that I had. And I kind of told my mom this, and that's kind of why I was angry about a lot of things. It's like, you made me so close-minded. I was so judgmental as a kid, and even into my early 20s. I had a friend, my roommate in college had a friend, and she was pagan. And I remember judging the shit out of that woman. And now I'm like, God, if I had just, like, been more open to things that weren't what I was taught, if I hadn't thought every person that I came in contact with, oh, I'll be their friend, to, like, make sure they're a follower of Christ.
Yes.
And I think that's also why, for me as a 35-year-old living where we live in Central Texas, it's, like, very hard for me to find friends, because I know how I was back then. I'm like, oh, let's take them to church. The second somebody's like, you want to go to church with me? I'm like, oh, never mind. I'll never talk to you again. Like, oh, no, thanks. Oh, why not? I'm like, well, I do my practice at home. That's like what I say. Like, like, I don't know. It's just, it's rough out there. And I will say, though, as far as my belief systems, like, when it comes to being the witch, like I already kind of said, like, what I believe the witch to be, I don't really do witchcraft. Like, I am a worshiper of the moon, of crystals, of plants, and I'm obsessed with self-development and growing. And I really think that that is the true path of the witch. At least for me, it's somebody who is constantly learning, constantly experimenting, constantly growing, and finding ways to be their best selves and to help others be their best selves. And I think that if that were something my family could, like, wrap their head around, they probably would be very accepting of it.
I feel like you just described Jesus. Just saying.
Was a witch.
It's just like, there's just been so much, like, ideology and just stigma put on this for millennia. And I think you got to ask why. And as somebody, it's just, it goes hand in hand for me, right? Like, the more I become a period coach and try to embody, like, womb goddess energy, the more I'm like, God damn it. Like, wow, you really did, like, a bunch of shit. Like, where were we before? Like, we were bleeding together as a tribe of women, and men would come to us in the tribe and, like, ask for our, like, downloads from universe as we all bled together in the red tent. And then the church came around and was like, that's terrifying. That's witchy. That's evil. Let's burn them all. Like, it's just a mess. It's a mess.
So you said, as a period coach, I would like to go a bit more into, the course that you've been going through, and a little bit about what you've learned, but more so of, how you're planning on taking this new information and becoming this coach. And I know you said you want to help women not be as terrified, younger women. So yeah, talk a little about that.
So the coach course that I'm in is called Cyclical. It is by a woman named Gemma Lee out of Australia, and it's 6 months. We will be done at the end of, so I'll be done by the time this airs. And we spent 3 semesters, the first one talking about like the actual ins and outs of the menstrual cycle. And we talk a lot about like ancient women's history. We talk about the whole red tent, like women bleeding onto the ground together and how that was just such like a community thing. We talk about how to coach and then how to run your business. And so for me, my number one aspect is obviously to help people feel more empowered by their bodies. And then I also really want to help like other coaches learn that if you sync with your cycle, you can like, God, you get so much more shit done, like so much more shit done easily. Like I can do all my work for like a month in a week because of the fact that I'm like working with my cycle. And that was mind boggling to me when I discovered that with very little stress, like so much, it's so easy. Like I'm just naturally into it at that point versus trying to like force myself to do things. And I just feel like we need a period revolution, like I just saw this documentary that came out recently by Vice News about period inequity across the world. And there are still so many people. Oh my gosh, there was like a news story out of India. This little girl killed herself at 13 because her teacher had shamed her because she bled through. And it probably was more than that, right? Like it probably was more than that. But like what I read in the news story was that. And there are girls who can't go to school in Africa because they don't have pads. And they have to take like weeks off of school every year because they have to stay home when they have their period, and they get so much farther behind so that they just end up sitting out or quitting. And it's just like, still, I feel like we've come a long way, but we have so much farther to go. So much farther to go. And when you think about even just the little things of how expensive pads and tampons are, and we have a pink tax in Texas, and like all this shit, like you can get Viagra without a sales tax, but I can't get a fucking tampon. What the heck? So it's just, I just watched this thing last week and I'm like thinking to myself the week before, oh, we're doing so great, blah, blah, blah. Then I see this and I'm like, wow, we have so much more to come. I did a past life reading. What was it? No, it was an Akashic Records reading with a woman that I had on my podcast. And she was like, you know what? I see you doing like a nonprofit. I'm like, oh, I don't really know about that. But now I see that documentary. I'm like, fuck, I think, yeah. Like just finding a way to like help the people who are unable to access like a quote unquote coach. Cause let's be honest, like a coach is something you pay for and it's expensive in some ways. Like people would see that as expensive. But I know also have this channel of myself that like gives of that knowledge. So I want to teach in schools. I want to teach in after school programs. One of the people that I'm coaching now is 12. So that's been like super illuminating because I'm like, let me stop I just want to stop your thoughts about this so quick and let you be able to live this life fully versus like me as 35 finally lit up about my period. Like I wasted like 2 decades. I could have been being wild and just like bleeding on the earth and doing sex magic this whole time.
I can think of that just as like, instead of you being terrified that week as you're going through with your period of like, hold on, pause. I'm just going to go bleed over there for a second.
Yeah. Wearing red as a little 11-year-old, like, yes, yes, yes. And I love there's like period parties now. And like, I really want to throw myself a period party. Maybe I'll do that. Just like reclaiming that week.
Yes.
And I think that would just be so healing because it's only been doing this work that I thought about those feelings. And I remembered that whole panicked 6 months afterwards where I thought I was pregnant. Like that only popped up into my head like a week or two ago. I was doing some like deep like work thinking back to reclaiming your menarche story. And I think also even as we all get older and we look into menopause, like the idea we've been told around menopause is that it's awful and you have all these night sweats and shit. That is not something that has to happen.
Yeah.
And like PMS, not something that has to happen. Like it's so much like of a thing that's told to us by the media and by society, when in fact, that's like not exactly true. And I would just say like, as we close this conversation, if you're hearing this, I would say the one piece of advice I have about your period is don't do shit when you're bleeding. Like if you can take time off, take time off. If you can't, just make sure you have more time for self-care. Like we're not working out when we're bleeding. We're past that now. You're not doing like boot camp classes. You can stretch, do some meditation and yoga, and just like take the rest. Like this whole idea, those like tampon commercials from like the early 2000s when they were like, you can push through Tampax Sport. Like I get it, because obviously we still have to go about our lives. And when we were young, like probably maybe had like a basketball game to play or whatever, but as much as you can, just like do very little. And then if you're into it, like look at that blood. Like it was such a thing that like I was terrified to look at. Like look at the color, look at what it looks like, even if you're just like pulling your tampon out and looking at it before you throw it in the toilet, look at it, like honor it, like look at what it is.
And I would say even from a not so much a witch's perspective, look at your pussy too. Even if it's just you want to look at health wise of it, like how you're doing and just that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Getting very acquainted with that area.
It's our lifeline. It should be just like checking someone's pulse, right? That is your lifeline into the status and condition of your body.
Mm-hmm. And even like knowing the right word for it, right? So forever, right? When I'm growing up, vagina, that's what you call the whole thing. It wasn't until like 3 years ago that I was like, if you see it, it's the vulva.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
If you can see it on the outside, that's like the general term for it. But having like a name for it that you like, and I love calling it a yoni. That's usually what I call it. But yeah, looking at it, going without underwear, like just like being like a little bit more free and just not being afraid of your body, right? So I feel like you have to take control of your body. And when you do, you're more empowered, whether or not you want to do all of the, period rituals or not, like just whoever you are, whether or not you're bleeding or not, just being able to trust your body, being powered by your body and not afraid and ashamed of it is like the motto of my life right now.
I love that. Well, tell our listeners as we close out where they can find you.
You can find me on Instagram at Leslie Draffin. I also have a podcast called The Light Within. It has new episodes on Mondays, and you can find that at The Light Within Podcast on Instagram. You can also email me, thelightwithinpodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll make sure it's in the show notes as well.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. This concludes another episode of our Weaving Magick podcast.
We release one episode a week, so be sure to subscribe to catch the latest episode as soon as it releases. You can find us on Instagram at Weaving Magick Podcast. That's Weaving Magick, Magick Podcast.
We would also love it if you could leave us a review. If you do, make sure to email us your review so we can send you a thank you gift. Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to find a way to weave magic into your daily life.